I guess we'll go ahead and get started. We gave everybody a couple extra minutes to get here. You're all here for the 501c3, 501c4 PAC discussion. Is that right?
Whatever that means.
Whatever that means. We'll dig into it and find out a little bit. I'll be moderating today. My name's Sean Akers. I'm the Dean of the School of Government at Liberty University and the Vice President for Middle Eastern Affairs with Liberty Counsel. And the two gentlemen sitting next to me, I got to tell you guys, are leaders in their fields and understand both these political structures and the political field better than almost anyone I know. They are incredible. I'm going to let each one. This is Ken Klukowski sitting directly to my left, and Mr. Rick Tyler sitting next to him. But I'm going to let both of them introduce themselves and tell you something about themselves.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Dean Akers. I'm Ken Klukowski. I'm on faculty at Liberty University School of Law, and also work with a couple think tanks and a legal journalist with Breitbart News in Washington, D.C. And as for me, I'm just going to give something of the framework in which we find these organizations that we're dealing with, and then my colleague Rick will talk about the practical how-to on exactly what those things do and how you can make them do them better. The issue, campaign finance has been a difficult thing that candidates and campaigns have been dealing with really ever since 1971 with the Federal Election Campaign Act. That was then after the whole Watergate scandal that was expanded by amendments in 1974. And it creates this massive federal system for regulating political activities in the context of campaigns. Now, of course, in a constitutional democratic republic like ours, under our Constitution, we have a representative government. But unlike some other nations on earth where it's representative government, but it was held by title or, passed on from generation to generation through family lineage, we have a democratic republic where we, the people, choose who will represent us for limited periods of time. And so that electoral process is the core of our American experiment. And the Federal Election Campaign Act, or FECA, was the attempt to create a regulatory framework to have the government regulating what citizens and candidates could do as they were choosing those that would lead the government. So when you think of it that way, there's an inherent tension in it. And FECA went up in a constitutional challenge to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1976, the case Buckley v. Vallejo. Originally, FECA limited how much a candidate could spend on his political speech to the nation, how much he could spend communicating his message to you, the voters, and also limited how much money people could give that candidate for him to turn around and spend. And in what is widely criticized as not just a liberal outcome, but a completely unworkable split-the-baby approach, the Supreme Court said that spending money is how a candidate projects his political views to the electors. And therefore, it is, in essence, political speech. So to limit how much he could spend was limiting political speech. And so they struck that down as unconstitutional. However, they said that the money he gathers to fund that speech, that because it is one step removed from the speech itself, and I know this gets confusing, but that's the whole point of why the Buckley decision is criticized. It is confusing. It's not that I'm not explaining it. It's not that you're not hearing it. It's that the Supreme Court has confused us. Is that they said because of it, it's still protected by the First Amendment, but it has a lesser form of protection. It only has an intermediate form of free speech protection. And so the Supreme Court said, so it's okay to limit how much you give to political campaigns, so long as the limits are not too low. Of course, the court does not go on to explain to us what is too low or how we're able to figure that out. They have knocked down, like in Vermont, you couldn't give more than $250 in the governor's campaign. The Supreme Court in 2006 said that is too low and struck it down. But they've, for the past really over a quarter century now, closer to 40 years, it's been an ongoing struggle with Congress on how to create a coherent regulatory system. And the body created by FECA, the Federal Elections Commission, FEC, their rulings and both their regulations and their rulings on how to administer this, it's just been a train wreck. So much so that there is a huge industry of campaign experts and campaign finance experts who just make all their living trying to make sense of this. Now, as that all applies here, the Supreme Court long ago held that it's unconstitutional to tax churches. Because if you could, to tax churches as churches, because if you could, then the government, then an anti-faith government, would be able to just impose crushing taxes on a church to drive it into bankruptcy and shut it down. Now, related to that, they have churches these days are designated as 501c3s under the tax code, the Internal Revenue Code. But the definition of a 501c3 is not only churches. It's a special class of tax-exempt entities for which your contributions are dollar for dollar tax deductible. And in addition to churches, you have charitable institutions and educational institutions. They're to have very, very limited political involvement, though. Then you have another section in the tax code, 501c4s. Those are also nonprofits. Your deductions to them are not tax deductible. By the way, please understand, because I should say this as a lawyer, I am not licensed to practice law in the state of Florida. All the information I'm providing is for informational and educational purposes only. I'm not intending to give legal advice to any of you on anything, okay?
It says that right there.
Well, this is being recorded, and I want to make sure I have that on the record.
That's what we call the disclaimer, by the way.
And I'll probably repeat it twice. The 501c4s can engage in political advocacy. Now, they cannot endorse specific candidates, but they can advocate specific legislation, specific policies. They don't have to just be charitable or educational. But again, your deductions to them are not tax deductible. Then you also have PACs, which are political action PACs, which can endorse candidates. And then you have a creation after the Citizens United versus FEC case, 2009, which created super PACs. Now, that is the decision for which President Obama, in early 2010, criticized the United States Supreme Court to the justices' faces during the State of the Union address before a joint session of Congress on national television, humiliating the U.S. Supreme Court by condemning the decision, saying it threw out a century of law, et cetera, et cetera. Now, first of all, that in and of itself was just an attack on a co-equal branch of government, and I think unprecedented in American history. It's no different they did a couple weeks ago, preemptively condemning the Supreme Court for possibly striking down part or all of Obamacare. But with Citizens United, one of the ways that the left has spun that decision, saying that corporations have free speech rights, is to say that, my goodness, this is a revolution. The reality is this. There were no fewer than 23 previous Supreme Court cases over more than a century saying that corporate entities have the same free speech rights as individuals. Because all a corporation is a collection of individuals. It doesn't have to be a for-profit company. It doesn't have to be General Electric or IBM. If you get together with your fellow citizens and you want to make citizens for a better community, and you just establish a corporate charter so that you can have a common bank account that you can use to pool your funds together and spend on political financing, that is a corporate entity. Not only that, almost all media entities are corporate entities. So if there were no free speech rights, Fox News and Drudge and Breitbart News, those could be constrained by the government. As long as it wasn't a single person just spending their own personal money, government would be able to control what they're saying. And the Supreme Court 23 times had reiterated again and again that just because ordinary citizens get together and pool their money in a corporate form, they don't lose any First Amendment rights in doing so. Now, in 1990, in the case Austin versus Michigan Chamber of Commerce, the Supreme Court had said corporations do not have First Amendment rights. It was a wrong decision, and then they doubled down on it in 2003 in McConnell versus FEC, where they upheld McCain-Feingold, the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act. So all Citizens United did in 2009 is it overruled Austin and that part of the McConnell decision to take us back to where free speech had been for 200 years. So that's the framework in which we find ourselves, and I'll turn things over to Rick Tyler, who will explain what it means for you.
Tell you what, let me sum up real quick, and then we'll introduce Rick, because I want you to understand a couple of things, and then really understand what it is that Rick's done that is truly on the cutting edge of this. Just to surmise, and why we're here talking about it with you today is not just to give you a history lesson on 501c3s, C4s, and PACs and super PACs. The question is, what can you as a citizen do? And we're telling you about these organizations because each of them is an avenue for us as citizens to do something. So it starts with the very basic, and this is usually where it ends, is saying, I'm a citizen. Okay, that means I can vote. Well, wonderful. Absolutely, you have to vote. But that really is just the end result of all the other powers that you have as a citizen of the United States. Really, the way I'd like you to think of it as we discuss these different organizations is, okay, that's a different way that I can do a different thing. So let's talk about them one at a time. Real quickly, I'm just going to recap what Ken has already taken you through. One, talking about you as a citizen. I can talk, I can speak, I can write, I can influence others. See, you are a member of We the People, which is, this is something I ask law students all the time. I ask them to tell me who the sovereign of the United States is, but I ask it a little differently. I say that blank is to the United States what King George was to England, or Pharaoh was to Egypt what blank is to the United States. And what do you think they say?
The president.
They typically say the president,
Right.
but you, sir, are absolutely right. I tell them it's not a trick question. All you have to do is read the Constitution. It doesn't say I, the president. It doesn't say we, the Congress. It most assuredly does not say we, the judiciary. It says we, the people. There are a variety of ways that we, the people, have had to learn to dance around draconian laws to figure out how to exercise those rights. One of those is you as an individual. One is the 501c3, which says that if you're going to do something charitable or educational, right, that you're going to be able to do so without having your speech taxed. And that means that if you start that kind of organization, you're asking yourself, or you're involved with that kind of organization, you're saying to yourself, okay, what I'd really like to do is primarily an educational thing or a charitable thing. But even within that, it's understood that there's a certain amount of influence you want to have on government. And it turns out that it's about 5% that you're allowed to lobby. So there's some political activity that can take place with the 501c3, but you've got this huge advantage of deductibility. So you can have people give to you and get a tax deduction. So it's easier to raise funds. But let's say that you want to take more action than that allows. Then you want to move up to the 501c4, which is usually, think about this, when you see organizations that have a 501c3 wing, for instance, most of you here are familiar with Liberty Counsel. Liberty Counsel is a 501c3. When you see action tagged onto the end, then you're usually talking about a 501c4. So Liberty Counsel Action is the 501c4 wing of Liberty Counsel. It can take more, right? You can be more aggressive in your political stances. Then the PACs that Ken talked about are, now here's where I want you to draw a real distinction between these PACs and super PACs when you're talking about how to use them. The PACs are where the FEC, which we'll debate later whether they have any authority to do this or not, but where the FEC says you can only give $2,500 to a candidate, but you can give an additional $5,000 to a PAC and let the PAC support candidates. But you're still talking about your political activity equaling dollar contributions, right? With Citizens United, the big change that took place was that for the first time they're saying unless you're working with a candidate, as long as you'll stay away from the candidate and not what they call coordinate with them, you won't plan with them, it's just speech. It's the same thing as Sean Akers wanting to say something by himself, and Sean Akers trying to get together 10,000 friends who want to say the same thing, and then they can afford to buy airtime to do it. Make sense? The court said, you can't stop that. It's just speech. So the super PAC is born. And you've got this ability now to bring funds together and say the same thing that you would as an individual on a very large scale. which it's got some ups and downs to both sides. And that brings us to Mr. Tyler, who, I got to tell you, these are so fresh and so new, people are still trying to figure out how to respond to the super PAC. Mr. Tyler is one of the ones who has run and worked with one of the more successful and newest of these super PACs, and I'd like him to tell you a little bit about himself and then take us into the depths of this.
Sure, thanks, Sean. My name is Rick Tyler. I started my political career shortly after a few, failed, miserable campaigns. That's how you learn, by the way. You lose, okay? You don't learn by winning, you learn by losing.
That's right.
And then I worked for a state party, which is also found under the same tax code. These numbers, 501c3, C4, that's the number of the code in the IRS regulations that tells you the type of organizations. That's all they are. So we refer to them by their number. And then I worked for GOPAC for over 10 years. GOPAC was an organization that trained candidates. I've done that in more than half the states. Did that in 10 years. That was a political action committee. Then I worked for Newt Gingrich for the last more than a decade. I served as spokesperson, political director, press secretary. Then during that time, I started actually a 501c3, which was an educational foundation. It was called Renewing American Leadership. Dr. Jim Garlow is now the chairman of that organization. It's still going on successfully. And I started Real Action, which was shorthand for Renewing American Leadership Action, Real Action. That was a C4. And so I started both of those organizations. And then I started working for the Gingrich Super PAC. What's important, I think, to understand is all of these organizations, in the sense that we use them, because there are many charitable organizations that are just not involved politically. They don't have a political agenda, although I'd argue in the end everybody has some political agenda because you want favorable legislation for whatever it is your cause is, which from making it easier to give money to you, that could be done through legislative action, to passing a law that helps accomplish whatever your mission is, whether it's solving a chronic disease or sex trafficking, as we heard earlier in the plenary. So they're all different kinds. What we wanted to, I think, discuss is how you can use these organizations in combination to most objectively. But just to fill in the background where Ken left off, is we've been having this argument since the beginning of the Republic. Jefferson was well known to have subsidized a newspaper, to beat the tar out of Hamilton. And Hamilton, in turn, subsidized another newspaper to beat the tar out of Jefferson. So political speech this is not new. So we've had this, but what has happened over the years, and I think most recently, and Ken could talk about, the reason, churches are told that they can't engage in political activity, which is 100% false within certain limits. But the then Senator Johnson, before he was president, tacked on an amendment to an unrelated bill that said, oh, by the way, nonprofits, because he was mad at two nonprofits in Texas that were beating the tar out of him, had nothing to do with churches. But then someone came along and said, oh, but aren't churches nonprofits? And over the years, we've come to believe that now churches are nonprofits, which they are, but they also have the distinction of being something very special, a church. That means tomorrow morning, when the pastor opens up the church, it is a church, and it is tax exempt by nature because of its status as a church. The ADF, which Ken does some work for, gets over 100 pastors, and Dr. Jim Garlow is very much involved in this as well. They get 100 pastors to go out and do speeches, political speeches from the pulpit. They record them. They send them to the IRS and said, I think we've violated the law. You should investigate. And guess what? To date, and this project's been going on for I don't know how many years now.
5 years.
5 years. And to date, the IRS has not filed a single charge against a single pastor. And it's important to understand, do you know how many churches have actually lost their tax exempt status via action of the IRS? Zero. It's never happened in the history of the Republic. McCain-Feingold was a simple law to accomplish one thing, to let incumbents keep their jobs. All it did was to restrict political speech, because it turns out that congressmen and senators do not like challengers saying things about them, and they certainly don't like people to raise money to put on television ads saying things about them. So that's what McCain-Feingold was all about. In Citizens United, I think the court ruled correctly, in my opinion, but they ruled too narrowly. And the creation of the super PAC came out of that decision, but I don't like super PACs, and I work for one. But super PACs, think about it. Super PACs are able to raise unlimited contributions from individuals and corporations to advocate the defeat or an election of a candidate. The problem with that is the candidate does not have an equal ability to do that for themselves. So while our super PAC is able to collect, and other super PACs, the Romney super PAC, the Rick Santorum super PAC, we're able to collect very large checks in the millions of dollars, these candidates have got to raise money at $2,500 a pop. That is just, in my opinion, if a candidate puts their name, fortune, and sacred honor on the ballot, why shouldn't they have an equal ability to protect, to control the message of their campaign? The fact is today they don't. I think that's just wrong. I think we ought to correct it. I wouldn't correct it by banning super PACs. I would correct it by expanding the ability of candidates to raise as much money as they can, because it is a speech issue. And all these laws that crack down on limiting funds to candidates and to political organizations is all about squelching free speech. Because, as it turns out, incumbents don't like competitors. You know, that shouldn't be a revelation to anybody. But that's, at its heart, that's what it's all about. And if somebody ever says, well, there's too much money in politics, and you retort, there's too much money in government. You know, the money is not in politics by comparison. It's in government, and the government spends too much money. And there are some organizations like my own who would like to see a much less limited government. But to get to the central issue here is what you can do in a very effective way. We started Renewing American Leadership, and it was to defend the family, faith, and free markets. And we particularly wanted to focus on free markets because relatively few people have occupied this space. Some have, the Acton Institute certainly. Michael Novak did a wonderful job when he was very active in defending free markets and faith. Jay Richards is a guy who's written a tremendous book called Money, Greed, and God, which I recommend to all of you to understand what the Bible actually says about free markets. And he does this great analogy about greed, which I think is really important, because greed is one of the seven deadly sins, of course. You don't want to be greedy. It's a very bad thing. God does not like greed. But think about the free market. If you are greedy, what do greedy people do? They do what? They hoard money to themselves. What do capitalists do? They
invest money.
They have to put the money out. They have to put the money out.
They invest money.
They can't keep the money to themselves, because if they keep the money to themselves, then it's not possible to be a capitalist, because you actually have to invest and hope for a return on your investment for yourself, your investor's profit to grow the company. That has nothing to do with greed. So that's what our organization is focused on. So the C3, which can take unlimited corporate individual contributions, and it is tax deductible to the individual. That is, if I give money to Renewing American Leadership, I can take a tax deduction for that money. So that's very attractive to people. There's another aspect too, is that those donors never get disclosed. So you can give as much money as an individual can give as much money as they want, and many donors don't want to be disclosed. Others want to be disclosed in a very big way. I mean, they'd like you to name a building after them, you know, and that's fine, and that's why you see buildings named after people. So then you have Renewing American Leadership. We can go out and educate people about faith and about what the Bible says about free market economics, which needs to be done in a very big way, in my opinion, because we don't teach it in the schools. We don't even teach free enterprise in the schools. Never mind what the Bible says about free markets. Then you have to, so that's good. We went out and do that, but we wanted to do more. We actually wanted to be involved politically. And so our organization was actually the organization that raised the money to begin the Iowa Judges campaign and the recall of the Iowa Judges. And so we hired Wayne Hamilton, a guy, an operative in Texas, very good operative. We hired Bob Vanderplatz, who became the spokesperson for the organization. And so we spent that money to defeat 3 judges. Funny story about that was when I remember calling Wayne, because there was no real precedent for beating judges, and this is a recall election. Remember, judges don't run against each other, but they are appointed by the governor, and then they are appointed for a certain term. And I think in Iowa the case was, I think it was 3 years. So, in any case, they go on the ballot, and basically the voters say, do you want to retain this judge? Yes. Or do you want to not retain this judge? No. And there were very few, there was a couple, but there were very few cases of how to run a race against nobody. And because essentially you have to go out and say, these judges are bad, vote no against them. And I called Wayne and I said, Wayne, I need you to do this. There's no money in it and you're going to lose. And he said, I'll do it. And so he did. He really believed in it. And he went in and they ran it was a brilliant campaign. It turned out that our organization was just born, and so we had no scale. That is, we didn't raise enough money because this donation was actually at that time represented probably 98% of the money we raised. So we couldn't take all that money and dedicate it toward a political purpose. So what we did is we gave it as a general purpose grant to American Family Association, Don Wildman's group, with no strings attached. In other words, I couldn't tell them what they had to do with the money. Luckily for us, Don Wildman directed all that money toward the Iowa campaign. And lo and behold, they defeated the 3 judges. So that's an example of something that a C3 activity could do. And I got to hand it to...
Shocked a lot of people.
Well, and I have to say,
Success story.
for Bob and and David Lane was involved in that, for Bob and David Lane and for Wayne Hamilton, I have to say they put scalps on the rail. That doesn't happen very much. We talk a lot about bad judges and this and that. They actually got rid of judges. I mean, that was really quite unique. And then of course the other organization is a PAC, and they can endorse. C4s can endorse. And the political, in my own situation with the Super PAC, it's been very strange because I've known Newt Gingrich for more than a decade, but I haven't had a conversation with him since last November because I got involved in the Super PAC in December. So I've had to sort of read the tea leaves and try to understand, which is my asset, I think, to the PAC, which was I could read the newspaper and try to discern what he was going to do, and then we would try to supplement.
Want to explain why that's important, by the way?
That you can't coordinate.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, just how easy that is to run afoul of or create the appearance of.
Well, it has to do with this term called coordination. Let me just say up front, it's stupid.
Yeah, it really is.
Absurd.
It's absurd.
Unconstitutional.
Yeah, John points out, right? He's a lawyer. It's unconstitutional. So it's absurd that I can't speak to anyone on the campaign, and we don't. We can. The truth is, we can, but because we wouldn't want to run afoul of any appearance, you don't want to talk to the campaign. The rule has to do with expenditures. That is to say, I'm not allowed to say to the Gingrich campaign, "Hey, we're going to run all these ads in North Carolina, so you don't need to do that." What you need to really focus on is doing, get out the vote or phone calls or this or that. And that's called coordination efforts, which would be the best allocation of resources would come from a plan. We have to sort of divine what they're going to do. But the truth is, I could say on the television, we're going to run ads in North Carolina. So there's really no needs for the campaign to do that, and he can watch that, and their campaign will watch that and say, oh, there's no need to run. I mean, so that's why because that's perfectly legal. As long as I discuss it in the public domain, it's not coordination. But if I discuss it outside of the public domain, it's suddenly coordination.
Rick
I'll
will
just
tell
stop
me,
there.
and Sean happens to be listening, and then Sean plans accordingly.
Well,
then
that would
Sean
be-
talks
yeah.
to me,
But if I
and
talk,
Rick listens.
but the thing is,
I'm the mediator.
if I talk to you with the intention that you would talk to Sean, that's a problem. That's
right.
problematic.
Yeah, don't send an email to your colleague saying, I'm going to tell Ken while Sean is listening so that he can play off me.
And for a while, this got really, really crazy. In one particular case, Newt Gingrich happened to sit down on a couch with Nancy Pelosi and do a little film spot. I don't know, some of you may have seen that. There were several odd couple type.
100 times.
Yeah. Pelosi was actually sued over that deal because the rules on these campaign electioneering communications has to do with when you run them. So they do something at a time when it has nothing to do with the campaign, but if it runs 60 days before a general or 30 days before a primary, all of a sudden it magically transforms into an electioneering communication, and you're in trouble. And she ran seriously afoul of it. So the point is that some of the tactical moves that they take, that you have to take when you're doing this, is you have to really understand how these systems work, so you can insulate yourself even from a stupid accusation. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, one of the best ways, if you're thinking about how to use these organizations in coordination, you can do things like you can raise money. For instance, you can raise money for the C3, and let's say by phone call. And once the donor has completed the transaction and given the donation, you can then do an add-on to that call and say, oh, by the way, this organization is also engaged in helping our candidates who think like we do get elected. Would you like to donate $25 to this fund? So that's a way you can combine the thing. And if your different organizations have thematics. I mean, we talked about Renewing American Leadership, Renewing American Leadership Action. They had different missions, but basically their objective was the same, and that was, defending faith, family, and free enterprise. And so people can see them as sort of one effort. They don't really distinguish all the time between C3 and C4, but you have to be very careful about, this does this, and you can't commingle the funds, so you got to have a very good accountant, as you pointed out. They've made a cottage industry out of this to make sure that you are following all the rules correctly.
It's a big cottage.
So Rick, once they give a contribution to you, then they're a member of your organization, then you can communicate with them in a more aggressive way on the C4.
Yes, you can then solicit them for the C4. And the C4
Well, you
also...
couldn't solicit for the C4 straight up, but you could for the C3.
You mean in reverse order?
So you couldn't solicit straight up for a C4.
To a non-member.
No. So,
So C4 is not tax deductible.
Correct.
Well, it's
To
tax
the-
exempt,
to
it's
the
not
donor.
tax deductible.
Right.
And what that means that the C4 is not being taxed for what it's doing,
But
but you're
you
not
don't-
going to get an exemption for the donations you make to it.
Uh,
So it's harder to raise funds,
I see.
but all of these really fall under, I don't want to complicate matters, all these fall under Section 527 of the tax code, and all these 527s, political committees, political action committees, parties, the whole 9 yards, they're all considered tax exempt, meaning that they're not taxed for what they do. So it's easier to run a C4 than a for-profit when you're relying on funds, but it's easier to raise funds for the C3 than the C4.
To add a couple supplemental points, to add just a couple of supplemental points on that, to give some sense of how complex it is, because I know if you're on the receiving end and you're hearing all this for the first time, it's C3, C4, the PAC, Super PAC, it all starts to come at you. That's because if it sounds like a mess, that's because it is. and it's a mess that, as I said, started when Congress tried to grab the bull by the horns, or I guess actually jump the shark. I mean, jump on top of a crazy tiger as it's going on a rampage, and trying to make a law to regulate citizens' speech regarding the core of our democracy, that being, in whom will we vest governmental power? What should we be for? What should we be against? What candidate will serve what we believe is important? What candidate do we think is not good for what we believe in? And so you have that democracy is by necessity messy. And the issue is then you get government trying to regulate it when the whole point of this process is to determine who makes up the government.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when it becomes, these are passions run deep on these issues. And the idea of government presuming to have the ability to make a nice, orderly, democratic style where one side speaks for exactly 6 minutes and 20 seconds, and then they remain silent as the opposing side speaks for exactly 6 minutes and 20 seconds, and everyone is going like in a courtroom. It is just absurd. Now, that's an important hypothetical because that's what Justice John Paul Stevens said when he dissented in Citizens United versus FEC. He said, I don't understand why elections can't be like arguments in this court, where one side has 30 minutes, the other side has 30 minutes. They submit nice orderly briefs of specified lengths beforehand. We have a chance to sit there in quiet and read all the briefs, then we hear these arguments, we ask questions, and then at the end, we vote on which way the case is going to go.
I'm sure the court would love that. Yes.
Right, and that's how the Supreme Court does it. And for some on the political left and the judicial left, they can't understand why democracy just can't work in that same fashion. Now, the reality is two things. First of all, we just touched upon several things. The reality is there are all sorts of variations out there. There are MCFLs that came from another major campaign finance case a number of years ago. You have all of these divisions, and what we're left with each time is Congress tries yet again to just change the law to perfectly manage democracy, or subordinate to them, the FEC arrogates to itself the ability to develop some regulation that will make a perfectly ordered democratic society, and then the Supreme Court comes along and does something yet again that's unexpected. And so it keeps changing. This happens so much that I was one of the lawyers involved in the Obamacare litigation. And when we were to the part of the argument on the third day, where the debate was, should the courts, if the court strikes down the individual mandate in Obamacare, which I'm sure all of you have heard of, should they strike down only that section, or should they strike down the whole law, or should they take some part in between, strike down a big part of it but keep the rest? And Paul
Or
Clement,
should they rewrite the law line by line?
that's right.
That came up too.
And as Paul Clement, the lawyer for the states, was arguing that they need to strike down the whole thing, he said, otherwise this case is going to be the next Buckley v. Vallejo. And you're going to be left with Buckley all over again, something that's not right, and you know it's not right, and we're constantly tinkering with it to try and make it work, and it never works. We just go from one disaster to the next disaster. So that gets into the whole issue of this is what happens when government gets into the business of trying to say you can give money to fund political speech, but only this amount. Or you can give as much as you want to support a candidate, so long as you're not talking to the candidate so that you can be out there on your own. I agree with Rick. I have two more points. One is that I agree with Rick. I don't like super PACs because I wish they were not necessary. I think there is an inherent constraining ability because some of these super PACs can be out there, they can say whatever they want. And some people, you don't know who these people are, and that anonymity can lead to mischief. If a candidate, insofar as a candidate has to disclose, insofar as a candidate has to say, I'm Barack Obama and I approve this message, well, he's going to care a little bit about whatever the words were that were said in the previous 30 seconds because now he's directly associated with it. And obviously I'm using the president's name, but that applies for any candidate. The idea is one of the cornerstones of a democratic system in our political theory in this country is accountability and transparency. The idea that people are free to speak, but if you want to step up for public office, you announce your positions, you engage in the public debate, but at least people know who you are. And so to the extent you want to appear honorable, you want to appear civil, you want to appear intelligent, to that extent, it's going to constrain you from saying wild things or crazy things or just going on a scorched earth, nuke everyone approach. Because everyone's going to come back and say, that guy doesn't sound like a very pleasant fellow. I'm not sure I want him. To, among other things, control a thermonuclear arsenal. So the issue is, if we were to get out of this whole business, if Buckley v. Vallejo were to be overturned, then citizens could give as much money as they wanted to directly to candidates. Candidates then could spend the money as they believe best makes their case to the American people, and the fact that their name is attached to it is what would give the sense of accountability. That's how you restrain what the person's going to say. A candidate doesn't want to drop the F-bomb on television because there are parents who will be offended that their children are hearing foul language. And that's how you constrain that. One final note but all of these other things are because we have this precedent in place that just makes a mess out of trying to create government control of political speech. The Johnson Amendment. that Rick mentioned. I just want, because it's very brief, this is the wording of the Johnson Amendment. And again, it was passed by LBJ, who, if you see what he did as president with the Great Society in the 1960s, just pushed one. Now, it's not to say there weren't plenty of things he did that have proven to be socially beneficial, but it was a massive, radical
Resigning
expansion
was,
of
not running
government.
for re-election was one of them.
And it was a massive explosion in the size, cost, and cost of government, some of which we're dealing with now. Medicare and Medicaid, which needs fundamental reforms if they're not going to be rendered insolvent and bankrupt all of us. Certainly nothing our children or grandchildren will ever benefit from. But in LBJ's big government approach to everything, he pushed through, when he was still a senator, the following amendment, saying that churches could not, 501c3s, could not, quote, participate in or intervene in, including the publishing or distributing of statements, any political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for public office. Now that is a measure which is under current Supreme Court precedent, grossly unconstitutional. Now, when LBJ was president, he was appointing people to the Supreme Court who would have thought this was a wonderful idea. We got more big government rulings out of the 60s and 70s from his appointees as we've ever gotten from the appointees of any president of the United States. But the reality is the court now, we do not have a conservative Supreme Court, we have a moderate Supreme Court. But that moderate Supreme Court is the most conservative one we've had in 60 years. Having 4 liberals, 4 conservatives, and 1 moderate. The last time we had a conservative Supreme Court in this country was 1936. Took a big step to the left in 1937, and since that time we've gone from moderate to moderate liberal to scary ultra-liberal, back to liberal, and back to the line to moderate. It's been swinging back and forth. Where we are right now and where we have been since 2006 when Sam Alito took Sandra Day O'Connor's seat is this is, as a moderate court, the most conservative one that we've had really since the 40s. Now, one of the issues there is that you take Justice Anthony Kennedy, he's called a moderate. That doesn't mean on every issue he figures out where the 50-yard line is and he takes it. On some issues, he's more to what politically translates to the left. On other things, it's more to the right. On one hand, you have abortion, you have gay rights, you have the Bill of Rights applying to terrorists that we capture on foreign battlefields. On the other side, you have gun rights, at least to a small extent so far. You have some religious liberty, and you also have free speech. That's probably the issue on which Kennedy has the most conservative take in terms of that the free speech clause is to allow citizens to engage in unfettered speech regarding issues of public importance. So what the Alliance Defense Fund is doing with their pulpit initiative, and Jim Garlow is involved with, as Rick said, is that they are encouraging churches on one particular Sunday a year to give a sermon on a political issue in an attempt to influence an election, make sure the sermon is taped, and then sending it in to the IRS, saying, let us know if we're breaking the federal law. The idea here was that one of two things would happen. Eventually, the IRS would try and come after one of these churches, and then that church would have standing to bring a lawsuit to say what we did is okay because it's protected by the First Amendment, chase it all the way up to the Supreme Court, where I believe the current Supreme Court, the current membership, is very, very likely to strike it down as unconstitutional. Striking down the Johnson Amendment doesn't go half as far as striking down some of the other abridgments of free speech that this court has done over the past few years. On the flip side, if the IRS will not, and they have not, and I believe they have not because their lawyers there are smart enough to know, well, goodness, this Supreme Court would strike it down. Better to have this provision in law and scare most of the churches in the country to keep their mouths shut than to take it up to the Supreme Court, have the Supreme Court put the smack down, and everyone will know they're free to do this. Is that the alternative is if the Supreme Court never pursues one of these cases, the ADF is expanding every year the number of churches who sign up and say they're doing it, is that eventually it'll be a critical mass. Eventually there will be so many churches that preach on these things with impunity that it'll show that the emperor has no clothes, that it will show that this was a toothless threat all along. So that's what's going on with that, and I think that's important. That's one way that you can engage through your churches is to make sure that your pastor is aware of the Pulpit Initiative. Have him look it up on the
October 7th
internet.
this
It's
year,
there.
October 7th.
October 7th, is it? Thank you, John.
I want to make a broader point about this.
Please.
Because it's,
Go right ahead.
I
I'm
think
done.
the pulpit initiative is very important, but I don't want to confuse the fact. I don't think the ADF is trying to make preachers into political figures, and they shouldn't be. They're spiritual figures. In fact, where you see political figures and spiritual figures, and they aren't really spiritual figures, leaders, is in the Muslim world. In Iran, for instance, where you have so-called mullahs who are supposed spiritual leaders occupying political force. The reason that's a bad idea is because ultimately those two are inherently in conflict. This is the brilliance of the United States. And often on our side we lament, the separation of church and state that was in the letter to the Danbury Baptists written by Jefferson. The left twists it. But it really is the brilliance of the United States that we separated these powers. De Tocqueville noticed this in Democracy in America. He couldn't understand how all these preachers had all this influence. In the United States, they didn't have any political positions. That certainly wasn't the case in 19th century France. And where all the clergy, of course, had political power. And here in the United States, it didn't have political power. So what the ADF is actually asking the preachers to do is what they did every Sunday from the birth of the country. In fact, the awakening, and Matt Staver talked about this yesterday, which is so important, is to make this connection between the awakening. I remember watching a PBS special on the American Revolution one time, and they had this muckety-muck scholar from the muckety-muck, who held the muckety-muck seat at the muckety-muck university, going on and on about, this idea. It's just incomprehensible. How could all these people who were so loyal to the king and loved the king, and they did, in 13 short years, turn around and have this petition against the king, known as the Declaration of Independence, which listed their grievances against the king. Many of them had to do with the courts, of course, because they were tyrannical. Some of them had to do with taxes. Ironically, I don't think we get to taxes till number 10. And she says it's just a mystery. Well, it's not a mystery. Of course, it's not a mystery. It was the Great Awakening happened. I mean, the pastors were preaching this stuff from the pulpits. All that stuff in the Declaration of Independence about our rights come from God, certain inalienable rights, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident, which is a really diplomatic way of saying any idiot can understand this. We hold these truths to be self-evident that among inalienable rights, and there's probably 24 inalienable rights, that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, life being essential first, number one. That's the thing the government, by the way, is supposed to protect first. Life. Okay? Mm-hmm. Why? Because liberty is of precious little value to people who are dead. And you cannot pursue happiness unless you're free. And that combination of acknowledging the power comes from God to the people, and we loan power from the people to the state, that flipped the whole world upside down. No one had ever done that before, which made us what? Exceptional. We were the exception. That's why we are exceptional. It's not that we're better than everybody else, because people come from all over the world here to be just like us, to be exceptional, because we're the exception. And from that, you get 4% of the world's population to produce 1/3 of the world's wealth. How is that possible? That had never happened in all of human history. And it's because God has made us individually sovereign. The founding fathers acknowledged it. All of that came from the pulpits. All that came from the preachers of the day. So here you have, years later, people often lament, and this I'll get to the point about the C3s. The left would like to destroy the C3s, okay? Because C3s do the work that they actually think the government should do. Mm-hmm. And here's the problem with that. If, in fact, we were all benevolent and sinless like Jesus, I'd be all for a big government. In fact, you can break it down to one thing. If there's either a God or there's not, right? So if there's no God, that's a rational position. It's not my position, but it's a rational position. Or there is a God. And if there isn't a God, then you are really going to need a big government, right? Because this is it. This is heaven on earth. This is all we get. We got to make it the best we can. We got to have the kingdom here. We got to be the utopia here. Or there is a God. But if there is no God, there is no analog to God, because we can't appoint someone. Sean, will you be God? You be God this week.
I'm not up for it, sorry.
We'll let Barack Obama be God. So what they have is they have government as God, and government is supposed to solve all the problems. So Barack Obama goes to the National Prayer Breakfast, and I give him credit for going, and I give him credit for quoting the Bible accurately, which he did, but he misapplied it because he said, he talked about Jesus' admonition to help the poor, right? And Jesus does talk about that. It didn't make God's top 10, but that's beside the point. So therefore, his argument is you should allow the government to steal your money to give to other people. Okay, that's his biblical basis, which he cited. That's the conclusion of his argument. But in fact, the Bible doesn't say that anywhere. It doesn't say anywhere that you should take your money, you should allow your money to be stolen to be given to other people. In all the cases where it says you take care of the widows, the orphans, the children, the homeless, the hungry, the imprisoned, the infirm, every case it says you. And there's a reason for that, because if government just taxes people compulsory and I have to pay them, I can walk by the homeless, the hungry, the helpless. It's not my problem. This is how the left thinks of things, because government will take care of them. That doesn't change any hearts and minds. And what the C3s can do and churches can do, we were having a discussion about this over lunch. The fact is, it would be rather inexpensive to get everybody off of welfare. We think that it would be really expensive. But then I was reading in the paper, there was a $630 million lottery. You remember that? It was a couple weeks ago, the Mega Millions. Wasn't it 630 million?
Yeah. 600 something.
Okay, well, how many Americans are there in the United States, men, women, and children? About 300 million. Well, that would be 2 million each. If you gave 2 million each to everybody, no one would be in poverty. Everybody would be a millionaire. So that tells you it's not a lot of money, because they gave that away to 3 people. But just take one state, like Mississippi, and just go find out who's on welfare and figure out how to compete with the government to get them off of welfare. That's what the church is supposed to do. That's what the C3s are supposed to do. I don't know why we haven't done it effectively, because it seems to me if you did it effectively, you'd put the government out of business. They have no ability to put people on welfare because no one would qualify, because we would figure out the compassionate, correct way to get people off of welfare. This is why the left wants to destroy C3s, because they don't want competition with the government. So how do they do it? They say, it's all about the tax deductibility. They'd love to get rid of the church tax deductibility, and they'd love to give away the C3 tax deductibility, because they want all that money. They see that as their money, and they want that money to go to the government. And by God, if we had that money, we could solve all these problems that Lyndon Johnson's been trying to solve since the Great Society. The other group that wants to get rid of C3s, churches and C3s and C4s, and loves McCain-Feingold, loves to limit political speech and all this other, is the press. And why is that? Because they don't like competition either. They want to be able to write what you should think about our elected officials. The editorial boards are vehement against all of this money in politics, because the editorial board of the New York Times would likely just tell you who to vote for, and that's it. They don't like the influence. So the C3s and the churches have got to step up and compete for the public space, that from all of these angles, from protecting religious freedom to curing chronic diseases, to helping the hungry, the widow, all of these things. That's why the C3s and C4s are really important. But none of these things can be done outside of the political context. People who don't pay attention to politics are in real trouble, because these are your competitors. These are the people who are trying to take you down, even if you have a good cause. They will try to take you down, because they really believe that it's not your job, it's the government's job.
If I could add just one last point to that, there was a relevant Supreme Court case. What Rick says is very important. Talking about those that would like to abolish the incentives to be able to get to 501c3s, to just eliminate a special status that they have, is the Supreme Court decided Arizona Christian School Tuition Organization versus WIN. Now, don't worry, you don't need to know the whole name. It just goes short form by WIN, W-I-N-N. It's a case out of Arizona that a friend of mine, Congressman Trent Franks, when he was a state legislator, created this system where the Arizona Constitution did not permit citizens to give, did not permit state government to give money directly to religious schools. So instead, they passed a law that set up this system where you can set up a school tuition organization. And then people of any faith can give to any of these organizations that they want, and they have a dollar-for-dollar tax credit doing so. So it's just like giving something over to what would be a 501c3 organization. And then those organizations, which are separate, they're private entities. Some can be dedicated to funding Catholic schools, some evangelical schools, some Jewish schools, others maybe to secular private schools, such as charter schools. And the idea was this was a way that worked under Arizona's legal framework. Well, you got some people on the left who brought a lawsuit saying, well, you know what, some of those dollars are going to religious schools, and haven't you heard of the separation of church and state? So they filed a lawsuit. Eventually gets all the way up to the Supreme Court because, not surprisingly, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit got it wrong and struck down the Arizona law, so the Supremes had to take it. I wish they would take more along those lines. But the court, 5-4, held that the decision maker here of whether the money goes to a religious institution, the decision maker was not government. It was a private citizen giving to a private organization. And then the private organization decides which one to give it to. The fact that someone got a tax incentive out of it, there's nothing wrong with that. That's what the government said. And specifically, they kicked it out for lack of standing, saying the plaintiffs haven't been harmed by this. Why is it any business of theirs? How have they been injured? They don't even have standing to bring this suit. The 4 dissenters, Justice Elena Kagan, one of President Obama's appointees, wrote a dissent. And it was a scathing dissent, a blistering dissent, where she said that in this decision, the majority was trampling upon one of the fundamental safeguards in our constitutional system. She said it was just an accounting gimmick to have set up this system whereby these Christian schools were getting money. Mm-hmm. She said any system in the tax code that incentivizes people in such a way that it directs their money to a Christian, to any sort of religious institution, that violates the Establishment Clause, and that needs to be stopped.
But Solinder's okay.
Solinder's fine, because, it's an abject failure, but at least it's a secular bankruptcy. It's okay to waste your money so long as you're giving it to something of no eternal value. The issue becomes that as I read her opinion, there was no way that logic would not also apply to saying that the deduction you get for giving to a church is also unconstitutional. You are getting a deduction. Under that logic, you could still say that churches are tax exempt, but that no church member, no giver, not just to a church, but to any ministry or to a Christian school in this case. That's something that said that you get a deduction or a tax credit. The fact that you are being incentivized to give to this faith-based institution, that violates the Constitution. That means that the 501c3 tax deduction in the minds of those 4 justices is unconstitutional. Meaning, if this president were able to appoint one more person who thinks that way to the Supreme Court, replacing not one of the current ones who think that way, but replacing Clarence Thomas, Antonin Scalia, Sam Alito, John Roberts, Anthony Kennedy, replacing any one of those, the whole system that we've had heretofore could be done away with, where we would effectively, just go talk to your pastor, ask them what type of hit they would get if those giving their tithe could no longer write it off. Of course, many people would still give sacrificially. And no doubt, in the majority opinion, the leftists, the liberal majority on the Supreme Court would say, the Lord loves a cheerful giver. They might even quote the Bible. And, the Lord loves a cheerful giver. People can still give. They just don't get a tax break for doing so. And you know what? If their motives were pure, they wouldn't need the tax break anyways. Well, the reality is when we're paying for Obama's inflation, when we're paying for President Obama's health care, when we're paying for higher energy prices because he won't allow a coherent energy policy, when everything else in our lives is getting so expensive, including funding an out-of-control government, and even then into over $1 trillion annual deficit because they just can't take enough from us. When we're giving all of that, it starts to put a pinch on people in terms of how much they can give to their church. We don't have unlimited money because unlike the federal government, the rest of us has to live within a budget. So as a result, understand that these things are real, all the things we're talking about, on the free speech side and on the religious liberty side. The law is only as good as the judges that interpret it. And understand that that is an issue we are facing here, not just with the U.S. Supreme Court, but on those in the lower courts, the circuit courts of appeals and the district courts beneath it. And that's something else that you need to be thinking about, praying about, and sharing with your fellow citizens as we're trying to do the right things in this electoral cycle to make sure that we still have all of these options and avenues to be able to engage in political speech for the sake of preserving liberty, not just for ourselves, but for our children.
You know, we've got just enough time for a couple of your questions. Let me add a spiritual note to this too. This is one of those places where, when we talk about being in the world but not of the world, the irony really comes home in a debate like this. We're saying that the system shouldn't be this way, but in order for you to have your voice be one of the ones that can change it, you've got to understand how to operate effectively within that system, just so you can change it. Does that make sense? Because those who understand the 501c3 structure that we're not happy about, the C4 structure we're not happy about, the PAC structure we're not happy about, the super PAC structure that we're not happy about, in order to do anything about those, if you don't know how to use them in their current form, you don't get a voice in effectively trying to change them. And here's something interesting. Rick made a great point about this mixture of religion and politics. Look, if you look to the biblical example, it clears it up for you. When we talk about usually the ministry, we talk about the fivefold ministry in the New Testament sense. But in the Old Testament, we were taught that there were three offices: prophet, priest, and king. Let's look at how did they operate together in society. It's very simple. It really was. The king, well, let's leave the king for last because that's the one we pretend doesn't exist anymore. You had a prophet who came and told everybody, including the king, by the way, what the word of the Lord was, especially when it was a hard word, especially when it was something that people didn't want to hear. That's nobody. Yeah, they sawed them half in logs. They ran them out of town. Nobody really liked the prophet. The priest comes along,
all of you.
or the pastor comes along and says, here's the hard word that he just gave us. I'm going to show you how to live that out. It's okay. We'll make it. Let me show you how to live that out in your real lives. And then there was the calling of king, and we ignore it. We act like it doesn't exist anymore. But the fact is, David, Daniel, Joseph, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, all of these men were Esther. All of these men and women were operating in this kingly anointing that said, okay, how does what the prophet and the priest gave us, how do we live that out in the civil government realm? Now, under a kingdom, that usually fell to a king. But like we discussed earlier, the king of the United States is you and I. It's the first time in the history of history that God has vested the sovereignty of a nation on we the people. Now, that's hard to live with, because if God's going to judge the sovereigns of nations for the way they ran nations, I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, that's us.
Yeah.
It's us. That's why we're trying to teach you how to be the most effective sovereign in the world. So when we stand before a living God, we say, I didn't sit back and silently say, well, the governor or the president should have done something about the 50 million babies that lost their lives. I did something about it. Somebody should have done something about the ashes of the Jews that were falling on the streets of Germany. I did something about it. And in fact, I'll never forget having gone through the internet one day and saw a picture of George Tiller's institution, and sure enough, there it was, black ash raining down and people picking it up with their hands. This happened in the United States of America. The problem is we can't blame that. We can't ignore the king calling. It's been thrust on you. Daniel tells us that God lifts up kings and puts them on their throne and dethrones them at will. That means not only you didn't just fall into being the sovereign of the most mighty nation ever to exist in the history of history. You were destined for it. This is active citizenship that we're talking about. This is the meat of what we're talking about. Let me take your questions. Any of you? Yes.
You have a C3, a C4, and a state PAC, and this may be too complicated, but what activities trigger 527 reporting requirements, number one, and number two, if I do something that doesn't cost money, like create a Facebook page and criticize the president with it, or tweet, or just say I endorse this person and use my own personal computer and not, send out an email to a list press I have, is that trigger 527 reporting requirements?
Ken, under the condition of not offering legal advice, but educational only, would you
Actually,
like to?
actually, as a matter of putting form over substance, if you had asked the question without saying you had such an organization, I could say it's educational and informational. Once you identify that you have such an organization and so you may act upon what I say, I'm not licensed in Florida, so no, I can't comment.
Well, 527 requirements are not Florida requirements, these are federal. That's fine.
Still,
Well-
if I'm sitting in Florida when I say it, I'm subject to Florida discipline. Seriously.
I'm an attorney too, so I'm in the
Nice way to
same boat. But Rick, would you like to?
You want to practice law without license?
I'm not a lawyer, but I play one on TV. Our group treats all of those, you say that a Facebook has no cost. However, somebody spent time to put it up, and that person was paid, and they probably may have been sitting at a computer, whether or not it was owned by the PAC, I don't know, or in an office space. I mean, there's lots of things, and I think a lot of these things are not tested. We report, all the. I don't really know the answer to your question. I mean, I don't know whether posting a Facebook is engaging in political activity or not. It probably depends on the content of what you're saying. I mean, if you have an organization and you clearly say, we should defeat Barack Obama, or by contrast, vote for his opponent, you're in the zone of having to report if you have a 527, if you have one of these organizations. You can do it as an individual, of course, but if you have an organization, I think you're in a great area.
What is a 527? The fact that I have a state PAC, is 527 an entity in and of itself?
That's a
or is it-
section of the IRS code, and all of these other things that we're talking about, the C4s, all of them are technically 527s. Now, for a long time, the reason that's confusing is because for a long time, it's moot now with super PACs, but for a long time, we treated 527s as issue ad organizations. In other words, if you weren't a C3 and you weren't a C4, but you wanted to run issue ads where you never identified a candidate, but you were just talking about an issue, then that's what we call those 527s. It's really become largely moot. And the way we use those was real interesting. Dick Morris used to use them when he was working with Clinton in a real neat way. He would go into towns prior to Clinton giving a speech, prior to Clinton coming to the town, and he'd run, I'll make something up, he'd run a bunch of USPCA ads that says why you shouldn't kick fuzzy puppies. Nobody can disagree with this. And for weeks you're being steeped in, boy, I really don't like people who kick fuzzy puppies. Kicking fuzzy puppies is a real problem in our society. And then weeks and weeks later, after you're already internalized this, Clinton shows up and he says, I'm so glad to be in your town, and I'll tell you the one thing that's really important to me is don't kick fuzzy puppies. And then everybody says, hey, he's one of us. And they, yeah, boy, he thinks just like I do. And that's the way we used 520, what we called 527 organizations. But now, with super PACs being what they are, there's no need to use the 527. You can just go out and say anything you want to, as long as you're not coordinating with the candidate. Let me point you toward a resource, though. Even as an attorney, I love this resource. If you want to see the way things are, not the way they should be, but if you want an accurate portrayal of how they are and answer a bunch of those questions about in-kind contributions and what's too far and what's not, the FEC, I think it's fec.gov, has a candidate's kit. It's got a wonderful, very lengthy, but wonderful and well laid out, well organized documented. Things very long, but it really does walk through the ins and outs of how far you can take those things. Yes.
As far as a PAC, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
As far as PAC and super PAC,
Uh-huh.
a PAC is where you can take a limited amount of contributions and they're not tax deductible, versus super PAC, you can take a limited amount and they are tax deductible.
Neither is tax deductible.
Yeah,
Neither is tax deductible, but one has a limitation on the amount of contributions per person or per organization. versus unlimited on the other one?
I
Is
think
that what you're saying?
that's still right. Right?
That is right. Now there is a think of it a little differently though. Think about what you're trying to accomplish. If what you're trying to do is route your money to a group of candidates that support a general cause without picking a particular candidate, you're using a PAC. You're giving this money to a PAC and saying, PAC, I know what you're interested in, like say it's a Second Amendment PAC. I'm not telling you which candidate to give it to, because I can give any one of them $2,500 myself. I'm giving you the full $5,000 that I can give you, so you can disperse it as you see fit among these candidates.
The PAC can give a $5,000 contribution.
That's right,
To the candidate.
to the candidate.
And an individual can give $2,500. Although if you're married, your husband and wife.
So as
Yeah.
a super PAC, then you can,
Now the super PAC, though, wait a minute. Think of these as paintbrushes in your toolkit. This one paints a line that transfers money from you eventually to candidates that'll support you. The super PAC says, I'm not giving any candidate my money. I'm not sending any money to a candidate. What I want to do is find a group who's going to get on TV or going to get in the paper or going to get wherever and make the case for that candidate without ever talking to the candidate.
Think of it as I don't see it any different than a campaign.
It really is. It's a campaign that the candidate's not allowed to take part
Right.
in.
And the media kind of got confused.
candidate-less campaign.
Yeah, like
Candidate-less
we
campaign.
did some,
That's very good. Yeah.
We did some grassroots groundwork here in Florida for Newt Gingrich, and the media was very surprised about that. Well, I thought all you did is run ads. And it's like, well, no, we can do anything we want. We can hire field people. We can do this. Now, it makes sense that because, if you have a donor who's willing to write you $1 million check, and they can only write a $2,500 check to the candidate, they would write you the $1 million check, and where would that money go? Television advertising, radio, most likely, because those are the big expenditure items.
Which they can do anonymously without disclosing.
Oh, yeah.
No, they have to disclose. You get all of our. In fact, we filed last night, so our report is online as of midnight last night, and it tells you where all the money came from, the individuals and corporations, and where all the money went, all the vendors, and all. You can see how much I get paid. So it's all there.
Which PAC are you with?
Winning Our Future. That was a
Oh.
Newt Gingrich, pro Newt Gingrich PAC.
And let me add a point to just, again, reiterate why this all exists. You want to help candidate Bill Smith as much as you can. All right, and let's say candidate for federal office. So you can give him $2,500 directly. But you want him to benefit more than he can just by having that $2,500. So you give $5,000 to a PAC that even though you can't tell the PAC where to put it, you know what this PAC is all about, and you know that PAC supports Bill Smith. They're going to give him $5,000. Now he has $7,500 from
Or
it.
they're going to run ads.
But
and
you,
tip
that's
benefit.
right. That's exactly right. But the thing is, let's say you have lots of money, and you wanted to give $20,000 to help Bill Smith. Well, now you've maxed out those two avenues, and let's say
They
there's
used to
not.
be a lot of money.
Yeah, it usually do, yeah.
Just wait till all this quantitative easing hits in terms of inflation. So you have, what does that leave you left with? $12,500? So you give it to a super PAC that supports Bill Smith. They're not going to give him any of the money, but they're going to run ads talking about how Bill Smith loves fuzzy puppies, or talking about how Bill Smith's opponent, Bob Smith, how he kicks those fuzzy puppies.
Right.
So either way, you're trying. That's right.
Yeah, or eats them. That's right. And interestingly, to add on to that, this is good. Listen to what Ken's saying, because if you take the cocktail approach of how to use all of these, this is what I'm glad this made it in. You can see then I can give money to a 501c3 to educate people about kicking fuzzy puppies.
Right.
I can give to 504 to get into the political side of kicking fuzzy puppies. I can give to a PAC to start supporting candidates who are against kicking fuzzy puppies, and I can give to super PACs to do it myself, or hire people that do it themselves.
So run
And
an ad-
all of this
so
comes
run
from
an
a
ad on your
Supreme
top
Court
favorite 10
case.
recipes about.
And all of this comes from a Supreme Court case where the court tried to impose limits on what you can give. And so this is just proof yet again that you can't make a perfect ruling that constrains political speech. All of these new avenues come
That's
up
right, yeah.
where people find a way to support the causes or the candidates
That's
that
right.
they believe in. If Buckley wasn't here, we could all just give $20,000 to Bill Smith, and then Bill Smith would direct his own campaign.
I think I skipped over you a while ago unintentionally.
This isn't exactly on track, but
Neither is what we're saying.
Side note here, but something that's driving me crazy right now is how is the U.S. Senate getting away with not passing the budget? My understanding it's constitutionally
That
required.
that is off track. I'll jump on that if I may. They're not constitutionally required. They are statutorily required. There is a law that was passed in the 1970s saying that the Senate has to, that the House and Senate must pass a budget once a year.
But the president must constitutionally submit a budget.
Actually, no.
No?
The president is not constitutionally required to submit a budget. In fact, I think the first one to submit a budget was Polk. I think I might be mistaken there, but I think it was the 1840s.
You know, that's just freakish. I mean, that's
Was
just
the-
me. But
It's-
that he would know
it's-
that.
No, originally it was entirely a congressional prerogative. Now, the State of the Union says, the State of the Union clause says that the president in the State of the Union can propose subjects that he thinks are worthwhile to the Congress. And that is, it doesn't specify budget. It could be legislation. It could be anything. It could just be, you know, cookie recipes or his thoughts on why we shouldn't kick fuzzy puppies. Or I'm sure President Obama would like to, a tax associated with something involving kicking fuzzy puppies. But just because, you know, that puppy moves, tax it. But the,
Tax it or eat it.
His own budget got defeated 97 to zip, you know.
what's that?
The president's budget, as you know, not even one Democrat in the Senate would
Yeah,
vote for it.
right, and the president wasn't legally required to submit one. Anyways, the Congress is legally required to pass one. The thing is, no one has standing to sue to legally compel them to do
That's
so.
what
Yeah.
I was wondering.
And,
Who can come against
No
them?
one.
Right.
It's right. That's right. This would be under what's called the political question doctrine. A court would say this is not justiciable because these are elected officials. They answer to the voters, and it's up to the voters of their home states to hold them accountable for what they do and don't do in terms of this requirement.
In other words, the response is to communicate through one of these organizations we're talking about why you're voting them out of office and then vote them out of office. It's a political answer to a political question.
Is it sovereign immunity, or is it just their?
No,
No, it's
just
not sovereign
judiciability.
immunity. Sovereign immunity would be suing a state or the United States for monetary damages. Now, you also have absolute immunity, which legislators enjoy. But again, that's immunity against monetary damages. You cannot sue them for $100,000. You can sue them for injunctive relief. You can sue them to get a court to order them to do that. However, even though saying you must pass a budget, even though that's injunctive relief, so it doesn't fall within immunity, nonetheless, under the political question doctrine, a court couldn't decide the case anyway, so they still get away with it. It all comes back to the voters, which in a democratic system, 9 times out of 10, that's the way we want it to be. Now, we've got that 1 in 10, where we want the courts to be able to step in. But 9 times out of 10, when it's an issue of a democratic republic, we want them to answer to us, and for us, through our votes, to hold them accountable.
Okay, I think that's just about time. If anybody else has got additional questions, I'm sure we can hang around for a few minutes, but our time's about up, so whatever's next on the
Who do you work for, if
list.
you don't mind me asking?
I'm on faculty at Liberty University School of Law.
Oh, okay. Appreciate it. You're very knowledgeable.
Thanks for your time, gents.
Thank you.
Thank you.